I had opened that safe hundreds of times before. 3 turns to the right. 2 to the left. 1 more to the right. The sound of the dial clicking had always been comforting. Like the heartbeat of the house David and I built together. That morning, though, the moment the door swung open, the air changed. Empty. Every velvet box, every small pouch that used to hold my jewelry was gone. The emerald earrings David gave me for our 20th anniversary. The pearl necklace from my mother. The gold bracelet with each child's name engraved on it. The ruby ring from our wedding day. All gone. I stared into the hollow metal space, unable to breathe. For a few seconds, I thought maybe I had misplaced them. Maybe Ethan had moved them for safety. But deep down I knew better. My knees trembled as I gripped the door frame. That safe had been in the same corner of our bedroom for 30 years. No one knew the combination except me. Or at least, that's what I believed. I was still standing there when I heard footsteps behind me, looking for something. Mom. It was Vanessa, leaning against the doorframe, holding her phone. Her lips curved into that polite smile that never reached her eyes. My jewelry, I whispered. They're not there. Oh. That, she said lightly. We gave it all to my mother. For a moment, the words didn't register. I turned to her slowly. You did what? She tilted her head, still calm. We gave them to my mom. You don't really need those anymore. Do you? She could use them more than you can. The room tilted. I felt something burning behind my eyes. But I wouldn't let her see me cry. Those were mine, I said quietly. They were my husband's gifts. My mother's pearls. She shrugged. They're just things. Mom, you always say it's what's in the heart that matters. Right, at your age. What do you need jewelry for? You hardly go out anymore. Her words cut sharper than any knife. I took a slow breath. Then another. Trying to steady myself. You gave away my jewelry to your mother. I repeated, making sure I hadn't misheard. Vanessa smiled, as if this were a simple misunderstanding. It's fine. My mom was thrilled. She said she'd clean them up. Maybe use a few for her shop displays. You should be happy they're going to good use. Her mother, Gloria. I had met her only twice. A woman with a thick perfume cloud and sharp eyes that scanned every room like a hawk looking for prey. I had never trusted her. But I never imagined she would have anything of mine. I stared at Vanessa. My voice came out quieter than I expected. You went into my bedroom safe. She rolled her eyes. Oh. Please. Ethan helped me. He said you wouldn't mind. My heart lurched. Ethan, my son, who used to bring me flowers from the backyard when he was 5. No. I said firmly. Ethan would never agree to that. She smiled again, almost pitying me. You'd be surprised what he agrees to when it makes sense. He said you've been forgetting things lately. That you should simplify your life. I felt something inside me shatter. Small and cold. So that's what she'd been telling him. That I was old. Confused. Senile. The perfect story to make me powerless. Vanessa turned to leave. But I stopped her. Where is he? At work, she said casually. I told him I'd explain everything. You can relax now. Mom, we did you a favor. A favor. The room blurred. I steadied myself on the dresser, the mirror reflecting a woman I barely recognized. Gray hair unbrushed. Eyes tired. Face pale. I had survived losing my husband. I had survived loneliness. But this was different. This was betrayal. Right under my own roof. I forced myself to stand straight. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. You're right, Vanessa. I don't need those jewels anymore. She smiled, satisfied, thinking I had given in. But you, I said slowly, are going to need a lawyer. The smile vanished. The color drained from her face. And for the first time since she'd entered my life, she had nothing to say. I walked past her, down the hallway that suddenly felt foreign, colder. Every picture on the wall seemed to stare at me, asking how I could have let this happen. I reached the living room, sank into David's old chair, and stared at the quiet garden outside. The roses he'd planted were blooming, red and soft, untouched by the rot that had crept into this house. I closed my eyes and whispered to him, "I'm sorry, David. I should have seen it sooner." When I opened them again, I wasn't crying anymore. The tremor in my hands was gone. What replaced it was something stronger, something sharper. I might have been old, but I wasn't weak. Vanessa thought she could steal my memories, my history, the pieces of love David had left me. But she didn't know me. I had spent 40 years married to a lawyer. I had raised 3 children through sickness, bills, and life's storms. I had built this home from nothing. I had endured grief and silence. No one, especially not a spoiled girl with a fake smile, was going to take the last part of my life and call it theirs. I stood up again, walked back toward the bedroom, and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. If Vanessa thought I was too old to fight, she was about to learn that age doesn't weaken a woman. It sharpens her. That morning, as sunlight touched the empty safe, I made myself a promise. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would not crumble. I would wait. I would watch. And when the time came, I would strike back, not with anger, but with proof. And when I did, no one in this house would ever forget it. Chapter 2 English version, first person. 08, 2 words. Prof is great. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face, his hand resting on my shoulder the night before he died. He had said, "Stay strong, Maggie. Promise me you'll protect what we built." I thought I had. 3 years had passed since he was gone. In the beginning, the house was too quiet. Every clock ticked too loudly. Every corner echoed his absence. The kids called often, but they had their own lives. Daniel was teaching at the university in Denver. Lauren was busy with her patients in Seattle. And Ethan, my youngest, the one with the soft heart, was still trying to find his place in the world. When he married Vanessa, I was relieved. She was charming back then, with her soft laugh and her talk about family. She called me Mom from the first day, brought casseroles, and rearranged my kitchen as if she lived here already. I told myself she was just enthusiastic. A few months after David's funeral, Ethan said they wanted to move in. It would save money while they looked for a house, and he thought it might help me feel less lonely. I hesitated but said yes. I wanted to believe family under one roof would fill the empty space David left behind. At first, it almost did. Vanessa woke early, brewed coffee, and talked about her plans to start a salon. She would sit across from me at breakfast, flipping through magazines, saying how she wanted to make women feel beautiful again. I thought it was sweet. Then small changes started. She put my china in boxes, saying it was too old-fashioned. The curtains David and I picked together were replaced with gray ones she said looked more modern. She moved the framed picture of David from the mantel to the hallway, saying the living room needed lighter energy. When I asked her about it, she smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'm just freshening things up." Ethan didn't see a problem. He said, "She's just trying to make it nice for you." I told myself it was harmless, but soon, she began sorting my mail before I saw it. Bills, insurance letters, bank statements. She'd hand me what she thought I should read and keep the rest. One afternoon, she came into my room holding my checkbook. Her voice was soft, almost kind. "Mom, You don't have to handle this stuff anymore. Let me and Ethan manage your accounts. It'll make things easier. I hesitated. David had always handled the big finances. But after he died, I learned every number, every password. I had to. Vanessa saw my hesitation. She tilted her head. Don't you trust us? Of course I trust you, I said, forcing a smile. Then, sign this, she said, handing me a small stack of papers. Just routine banking forms. Ethan stood behind her, his hands in his pockets. Mom, it's just so we can pay bills faster. You'll still have full access. I looked at his face, so much like his father's, and felt that old weakness of wanting peace. I signed. That night I sat in bed reading, trying not to think about it. The wind outside pressed against the windows, whispering like something trying to get in. Weeks passed, and I noticed I was no longer receiving certain emails from the bank. Vanessa said she'd taken care of online notifications. When I asked for my checkbook, she said she had it safe. Every time I questioned her, she smiled, talked fast, and changed the subject. She was good at that, always keeping things light until you forgot what you asked. It was around that time the neighbors started treating me differently. At church, one of them said with a careful smile, Vanessa tells us you're finally taking it easy. She says you get confused with paperwork sometimes. I felt heat rush to my face. I went home that day and looked around my house. Every shelf, every wall, every inch of space looked like it belonged to someone else. A few days later, Ethan came home with a new TV. He said Vanessa thought I'd like something easier to use. He took down the old one David and I had bought 20 years ago. I wanted to protest, but the words didn't come. That night I sat alone, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I remembered when this house was filled with laughter, when David would play his old jazz records and the kids would dance barefoot in the living room. Now the only sound was the hum of a machine I hadn't asked for. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Vanessa looking through my jewelry drawer. She looked up, startled, then smiled. Just cleaning. Mom, I thought maybe we could organize your things. I wanted to tell her to stop, to get out, to leave everything alone. But Ethan walked in right then, kissed her cheek, and said, She's just trying to help. So I nodded, pretending I didn't feel the ground shifting under my feet. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The wind smelled like rain. Linda, my neighbor and oldest friend, walked by and waved. You okay? Maggie, she asked. I smiled. I'm fine. Just adjusting. But I wasn't fine. The air in the house felt different, like I was being watched even when no one was in the room. Vanessa moved so easily through every space, touching everything that had once been mine. That evening, Ethan mentioned they were looking at houses again, but hadn't found anything good. I tried to sound casual. Maybe it's time you two find your own place. He frowned. Are you trying to get rid of us? Of course not. I just thought you wanted your own home. He sighed. Mom, Vanessa loves it here. She's taking care of you. Taking care of me. The words made me want to laugh and cry all at once. After he went upstairs, I opened my laptop to check my savings. The screen said the account was locked for security verification. I tried again. Same message. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse in my ears. The next day, Vanessa came home with flowers and put them on the table. For you, she said. Thought the house could use some brightness. I nodded. But my eyes went to the vase. It was crystal, one I hadn't seen in months. David's retirement gift. That night I couldn't eat. The roast I'd made tasted of ashes. I knew something was wrong. The jewelry, the money, the control, the neighbors' whispers, it was all part of something bigger. I sat in the dark until morning, listening to the clock tick and the rain fall. When dawn came, I went to the mirror and looked at myself. My reflection stared back. Tired, but unbroken. I said quietly, "David, if you can hear me, give me strength." Then I turned off the light, opened the door, and went downstairs. The house was still. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Vanessa was humming softly, her back to me, as if nothing in the world was wrong. But something in me had shifted. I didn't know it yet. But that morning was the first step toward the truth I'd been too afraid to face. Chapter Dry English version, first person. 112 words. It started with the curtains. I came downstairs one morning to find the floral drapes David and I had chosen together gone. In their place hung long gray panels, heavy and cold, shutting out the light. Vanessa was standing on a chair, adjusting them. "Do you like them?" "Mom, they're modern," she said, stepping down with a bright smile. "The old ones were too busy." I forced myself to nod. "They're fine." I wanted to say they were lifeless, that they made the room feel like a waiting room instead of a home. But I said nothing. I had learned that silence kept the peace, even when it scraped at your insides. By the end of that week, the framed photos of David and me were gone from the living room. When I asked where they were, Vanessa said she'd moved them to the hallway. "The living room needs lighter energy," she explained. "People feel more comfortable without reminders of, you mean my husband," I said quietly. She smiled like she hadn't heard me. It went on like that. My favorite quilt disappeared from the couch. The old rug was rolled up and taken out. Every time I asked, she said something about modernizing, about creating a better atmosphere. Ethan never noticed. He was always working, coming home late, tired. I didn't want to burden him. He had a gentle heart. But he avoided conflict like it might swallow him whole. One afternoon, I overheard Vanessa on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low, but I caught a few words. "Don't worry, Mom," she said, laughing softly. "She's harmless. I've got it under control." I stopped in the hallway, my heart thudding. Her mom, Gloria, the same woman who wore too much perfume and jewelry that looked suspiciously familiar. I stepped back quietly before Vanessa saw me. That evening, I tried to talk to Ethan. We sat at the table, plates of untouched dinner between us. "Ethan," I said, "have you noticed Vanessa's been changing things around here?" He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "She's replaced the curtains, the rug, the photos, even my things in the living room." He sighed. "Mom, she's just trying to help. You said you wanted the house to feel brighter." "I never said that." He smiled tiredly, like he was talking to a child. "She means well. You worry too much." I swallowed my frustration. I could see his exhaustion, the lines around his eyes. I didn't want to fight him. "Not tonight. Later." I walked through the house, touching the empty spaces where our memories used to sit. I thought of David's laugh, his records playing on the old turntable, the warmth that used to live in these walls. Now it felt sterile, staged, like someone else's home. The next morning, Linda stopped by. She leaned against the porch railing, sipping her coffee from a travel mug. "You doing okay, Maggie?" she asked. I smiled weakly. "Just tired, I guess." She hesitated, glancing at the house behind me. "I don't want to stir the pot. But I saw Vanessa at the farmer's market yesterday. She was wearing a necklace that looked an awful lot like yours. The pearl one." The words hit me like cold water. "Are you sure?" Linda nodded slowly. "I remember that necklace. You wore it to David's retirement party." I thanked her and tried to smile. But my hands were shaking when I closed the door. When Vanessa came home that evening, I was waiting. "That's a pretty necklace," I said. She looked down, touched it lightly. Oh, it's fake. Got it online for $20. It looks familiar. She laughed. You're imagining things. Mom. I let it go. But something in me hardened. Later that night, I went online and checked my bank account. The screen said I was locked out for security reasons. I tried again. The same message. The next morning, I asked Vanessa about it. She smiled sweetly. Oh. That. The bank probably flagged something. Don't worry. I'll call them for you. I waited a day. Then another. The account stayed locked. When Lauren called that weekend, her voice was calm but worried. Mom. Ethan's wife seems controlling. You need to check your finances. I told her not to worry. That everything was fine. But when I hung up, I knew she was right. That night, I walked quietly through the hallway. The house was dark except for the faint glow from under Vanessa's door. I heard her laughing softly. Don't worry. Mom, she whispered. She won't even notice. My breath caught. I stepped back into the shadows. The next morning, I asked Ethan to drive me to the bank. He frowned but agreed. When we got there, the teller asked for ID and a signature. After a few minutes, she looked up, apologetically. Mrs. Turner. It seems your account has a secondary authorization on it. I stared at her. A what? A co-signer. Ma'am. Someone named Vanessa Carter Turner. Ethan froze beside me. Back in the car. He rubbed his forehead. It must be a mistake. I didn't respond. I was too stunned to speak. That evening, Vanessa came into my room holding a folder. She said it was time to review the house expenses. I looked at the papers and saw my name next to hers on almost every page. I asked her where my original documents were. She said she'd filed them for convenience. You shouldn't stress over paperwork. Mom, leave that to us. I sat in silence. My hands folded on my lap. I felt like a guest in my own house, watching as someone rearranged not just my furniture but my entire life. That night, the rain came hard. I stood at the window, watching it streak down the glass. The reflection staring back looked older than I remembered. My hair, once silver and soft, now looked dull in the dim light. I thought of David again, of how he used to tell me I was the strongest woman he knew. For the first time, I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. Before bed, I opened the closet where I kept my jewelry. Everything was still there. At least, I thought it was. I touched each box, each case, reassuring myself that they were safe. When I finally lay down, I made myself a quiet promise. I would not let her take any more from me. Not the house. Not my memories. Not my dignity. But the truth was, she already had. And I hadn't even realized how much until it was almost too late. Chapter, Veer English version, first person. Null, Nagan, fear words. Linda was right. The moment she told me about that necklace, something inside me shifted from confusion to suspicion. I couldn't let it go. I kept seeing the way Vanessa's fingers brushed the pearls that had once belonged to my mother. How she smiled when I questioned her. Too confident. Too calm. The next morning, I drove to the small cafe down the street to meet Linda. The place smelled of cinnamon and old wood, a comfort I hadn't felt in weeks. She slid into the booth across from me, eyes sharp behind her glasses. Maggie, she said quietly. I didn't mean to upset you yesterday. You didn't upset me. You made me see what I didn't want to. She nodded slowly. I've known you 40 years. You've never been careless. If something's gone missing, it's not an accident. Her certainty steadied me. For the first time since David died, I felt a small pulse of strength. When I came home, Vanessa was in the living room polishing silver. She looked up, smiling that same easy smile. Morning. Mom, did you sleep well? Fine, I said. Then, pretending to sound casual, I asked, have you seen the pearl necklace lately, the one from my mother? She didn't even blink. I told you. I never touched it. I noticed her left hand trembling slightly as she wiped a fork. That evening, I called Lauren. She answered from her office in Seattle. Her voice low and calm like always. Mom, I've been worried. You sound different. I'm fine, I told her, though my voice wavered. But she heard it. Mom, promise me you'll check your accounts. And don't sign anything else without reading it. I'll be careful. After we hung up, I went online to check the bank again. The account still wouldn't open. My stomach tightened. I tried the savings account next. The one David and I had built for emergencies. It was nearly empty. The balance showed less than $3,000. The room spun. I stared at the screen. Then at my trembling hands. I couldn't breathe. The door opened. Vanessa walked in. Humming. She saw the laptop. Everything okay? Mom. My throat tightened. I closed the computer slowly. I must have clicked something wrong. She smiled. Coming closer. You should let me help you with that. Technology can be confusing. I wanted to slap that fake sweetness off her face. But instead I smiled and said, maybe later. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept looping through possibilities. If she could take my jewelry, my photos, my home. What else had she taken? The next morning I called Patrick Hayes, David's old colleague. He picked up on the second ring. His voice warm but surprised. Maggie Turner. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a while. How are you holding up? I hesitated, then told him everything. The accounts, the jewelry, the feeling of being watched in my own house. When I finished, there was a long silence. Maggie, he said finally. This sounds like financial exploitation. It's serious. What do I do? You collect proof. Quietly. No confrontations. No yelling. Just watch. That word, watch, stuck with me. For the next few days, I observed Vanessa's patterns, her phone calls, the way she avoided eye contact when I asked simple questions. She spent hours locked in the guest room that had become her office. When I passed by, I could hear muffled talking, laughter. Sometimes her saying "Mom" before she lowered her voice. One afternoon I heard her say, "She won't even notice. I swear." I froze. The way she said it sounded so familiar. Like the echo of a warning I'd ignored too long. That night, I waited until she and Ethan went upstairs. I crept into the guest room. The desk was spotless, but her purse was open. Inside was a receipt from a jewelry shop in Salem. My heart pounded. The name on the paper was Gloria Carter. The next day, I drove to the address on the receipt, telling Ethan I was visiting a friend. The shop was small and dim, the kind of place where the glass cases looked older than the merchandise. Behind the counter stood Gloria herself, wearing a gold necklace I recognized instantly. She smiled like she didn't know me. "Can I help you?" I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "That's a beautiful necklace." She touched it proudly. "Thank you, dear. My daughter gave it to me. A gift." My vision blurred. I left before my anger turned into something dangerous. Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel until my hands hurt. The betrayal burned deeper than I expected. They had taken not just things, but memories. The tangible pieces of a life built with love and loss. When I returned home, Vanessa was waiting on the porch. "Where have you been?" "Out," I said. "Why?" She narrowed her eyes. "You could have told me." "I'm not required to." Her smile tightened. "You should rest more." "Mom, Stress isn't good for someone your age. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote everything down. Dates, names, times, receipts. Every odd look, every missing object. David had always told me. Details win cases. Around midnight, Ethan came to my door. Mom, are you okay? I looked up from my notes, just thinking. He stepped in, his face full of concern but also weariness. Vanessa says you've been anxious lately. Maybe you should see someone. I smiled softly. I'll be fine. Tell her not to worry. When he left, I closed the notebook and locked it in my drawer. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint wind outside. Something had shifted again. I was done being afraid. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way to make them answer for what they had done. The next morning, I drove back to Patrick's office with the receipt and told him everything I'd seen. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. We're going to handle this carefully, Maggie. But you have to understand. Once we start, it won't just be family business anymore. I met his eyes. It stopped being family business the moment she broke into my safe. He nodded slowly. Then, let's get to work. As I walked out of his office, the rain had started again. The sky was low and gray, but the air smelled clean. For the first time in months, I felt something close to hope. I drove home through the drizzle, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm, and told myself that whatever came next, I wouldn't let them see me crumble. Because I wasn't just a widow clinging to old memories anymore. I was a woman who still had something left to fight for. By the time I got home that evening, Vanessa was already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her laptop open. She looked up as soon as I stepped through the door. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were sharp. You were gone a while. Mom. Out shopping. I hung up my coat carefully, trying to sound calm. Just running errands. Why? No reason. I just like to know where you are, in case something happens. You've been forgetting things lately. I bit back the words I wanted to say. Instead, I opened the refrigerator and stared inside for a long moment, pretending to look for something. The truth was, I didn't trust myself to look at her without giving everything away. When I turned around, she was still watching me. Her tone was soft, almost pitying. You know, Ethan worries about you. Maybe you should let me handle more of the house stuff. Bills, groceries, little things. It would make life easier. I smiled, but there was steel behind it. That's kind of you. But I'm not helpless yet. She tilted her head, her lips pressing together in a mock smile. Of course not. After dinner, I excused myself early and locked my bedroom door. I took out the folder Patrick had given me and spread everything on the bed. Receipts, photos, bank statements, the pawn ticket with Gloria Carter's name printed clearly across the top. Proof. Cold. Undeniable proof. Patrick had told me not to move too fast, to stay quiet until we had everything. But every time Vanessa opened her mouth, I felt the anger building like a storm I could barely contain. That night I wrote in my notebook again. I listed everything she'd done, from the first day she moved in to that very moment. Each line felt like reclaiming a small piece of my sanity. The next morning, I woke early and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The sunrise painted the trees gold, and for a brief second, I almost felt peace. Then the door opened behind me. There you are, Vanessa said brightly. I thought you might have wandered off. I forced a smile. Just enjoying the morning. She stepped closer, holding her phone. Smile. Mom, let's take a selfie. I hesitated, then nodded. She snapped the picture, her head tilted toward mine. Later, I saw her post it online with the caption, "Morning with Mom. Family first." My stomach twisted. That afternoon, Ethan came home early. He looked uneasy, rubbing the back of his neck as he sat across from me. Mom, Vanessa told me you've been acting paranoid. Paranoid. The word stung. I'm not paranoid, I said quietly. I'm careful. There's a difference. He sighed. She says you've been accusing her of stealing. That's ridiculous. Is it? He frowned. What are you talking about? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. Ethan, do you know where my mother's pearl necklace is? His eyes darted away. I don't know. Vanessa says she donated some old jewelry you weren't using. My pulse quickened. She what? He winced. She said it was for charity. Mom, you always talk about helping others. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor. That jewelry wasn't hers to touch. It wasn't junk. It was my family's history. Ethan looked helpless, torn between us. Mom, please don't make this harder. She's lying. Ethan, he didn't answer. I left the room before I said something I couldn't take back. Upstairs, I closed my door and pressed my back against it. For a long time, I just stood there, shaking. That night, after everyone was asleep, I checked the safe in my closet. My hands trembled as I turned the dial. 3 turns right. 2 left. 1 right again. Click. The door opened. Empty. For a second, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. The boxes were there, but every one of them was light. Hollow. The emerald earrings David gave me for our 20th anniversary. Gone. The gold bracelet from my daughter's wedding. Gone. The pearl necklace. Gone. I sank to my knees, gripping the edge of the safe. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. Behind me came a soft voice, looking for something. Mom. I turned slowly. Vanessa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, that smug little smile curling at the corner of her mouth. Where are they? I whispered. She shrugged. I told you. We donated everything. You don't need those things anymore. Donated. My voice cracked. To who? Her tone turned light, almost mocking. My mother runs a women's shelter. Remember, she said they could sell them for charity. Those weren't yours to give. She stepped closer. They're just things. Maggie, you always say it's what's in the heart that matters. I stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not the friendly daughter-in-law. Not the polite helper. But the predator she really was. You stole from me. Her smile didn't falter. Call it a donation. You weren't using them anyway. I stood, my hands trembling but my voice steady. You're right. Vanessa, I don't need them anymore. She blinked, confused. Because you're going to need a lawyer. For the first time, her smile faded. What are you talking about? You'll find out soon enough. I brushed past her and walked out of the room. My legs were weak, but every step felt powerful. Downstairs, the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I grabbed my phone from the counter and called Patrick. He answered on the second ring. Maggie, it's time, I said. She took everything. His voice hardened. Don't do anything rash. Come to my office tomorrow morning. We'll start formal proceedings. I hung up and sat in the dark, hands folded, staring at nothing. I wasn't crying anymore. I was past that. Somewhere upstairs, I heard Vanessa moving around. Pacing, maybe. I didn't care. The fear that had ruled me for months was gone, replaced by something sharper, colder. When Ethan came home late that night, I didn't say a word. I just watched him, wondering how much he knew. He avoided my eyes, and that was answer enough. I went to bed as the first drops of rain began to tap against the window. My mind was clear. I knew what I had to do now. The next morning would be the beginning of a different battle. One I intended to win. The next morning, the sky was still gray when I drove downtown. The streets were slick from rain, and the windshield wipers made a steady rhythm that matched the thudding in my chest. Patrick's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building near the courthouse, the same place where David used to meet him when they were handling real estate clients years ago. Patrick greeted me with a firm handshake. He looked older now, his hair fully white, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Sit down, Maggie. Tell me everything." I took a deep breath and told him what happened. The empty safe, Vanessa's words, Ethan's silence. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling. Patrick listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every sentence. When I was done, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This isn't just theft, Maggie. This is financial elder abuse, under Oregon law. It's a felony." The words sounded heavy, almost too big for the room. "Can she really go to jail for this?" "If we have proof, yes. But we need to build the case carefully. We'll start by gathering documentation, tracing your accounts, and identifying the pawn transactions." He opened a file and wrote down a list. "You'll need to open a new bank account in your name only. Move whatever funds are left before she drains it completely. And get copies of every withdrawal and transfer she made." "What about the house?" I asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "That's the good part. David left the property entirely in your name. There's no co-ownership. No one can take it from you without your consent." For the first time in months, I felt the weight on my chest lighten. Patrick leaned forward. "Maggie, you need to stay calm and act normal around her. Don't confront her again. Let her think you're still under her control. We'll collect evidence quietly until we're ready to move." I nodded. When I left the office, the air outside felt cleaner, the drizzle soft against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a plan. At home, Vanessa barely looked up from her phone when I came in. "Good morning," she said flatly. "Good morning," I replied, my tone even. I spent the rest of the day acting as if nothing had changed. I smiled, made lunch, folded laundry, all while keeping my eyes and ears open. I began recording conversations on my phone, leaving it on the counter during dinner or in the living room when she talked to her friends. That night, while she was in the shower, I checked her desk again. Inside, one of the drawers was a pawn shop envelope. I took pictures of everything before putting it back exactly as I found it. When I showed Patrick the photos the next day, he nodded approvingly. "This is perfect. We'll have a private investigator verify it." For the next week, I lived two lives. By day, I was the quiet, forgetful mother-in-law, smiling and nodding as Vanessa gave orders. By night, I wrote everything down, organized documents, and worked with Patrick's investigator through secure email. Every morning, I reminded myself not to break character. Every night, I reminded myself why I was doing it. One evening, while I was setting the table, Vanessa's phone rang. She answered quickly. Lowering her voice, I moved closer, pretending to arrange napkins. "Yes, Mom," she said softly. "The old woman has no idea. We'll sell the rest next week." My stomach clenched. She paused. "Listening. I know. But Ethan's being soft again. He'll come around once he realizes we need the money." I froze, the napkin trembling in my hands. I wanted to scream, to grab the phone and throw it against the wall. But I stayed still. Patrick's words echoed in my mind. "Don't act yet." That night, I called him again and repeated everything I'd heard. He sighed. "She's implicating herself now. That's good. Keep the recordings coming." 3 days later, the investigator sent photos of my jewelry displayed in a pawn shop window. My emerald earrings. My mother's pearls. David's gold bracelet. Each tagged with a price. Seeing them like that made something inside me break. Patrick looked at the photos and nodded grimly. They're in your daughter-in-law's mother's name. That's a deliberate attempt to hide ownership. Can we get them back? We can. But it will take legal steps. Let's get the police report ready first. That night, Ethan came home late. I was sitting in the dark living room, the folder open on my lap. He stopped when he saw the papers. Mom, what's all this? I looked up. Ethan. How long have you known? He blinked. Known what? About the money, the jewelry, the lies. He looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. She told you. Didn't she? That I was confused. That I imagined things. He didn't answer. I stood slowly. Look at me. Ethan. Do I look confused to you? He finally met my eyes. And for a second, I saw guilt flicker there. Mom. She said, it was for a good cause. A good cause. My voice rose. Selling your father's bracelet. Your grandmother's pearls. For charity. He winced. Please. Don't make this worse. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I can't change what you've done, Ethan. But soon, the truth will come out. And when it does, I hope you can live with it. He left the room without another word. The next morning, I packed every important document I had into a small fireproof box and took it to the bank. I rented a safe deposit box under my name and locked everything inside. That afternoon, Patrick called. We're ready to file the first report. I need your signature tomorrow morning. When I hung up, I stood at the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. Vanessa was outside in the garden, talking on her phone again. I couldn't hear her words, but I could see her smile. I thought about David then, about how he used to tell me that justice always finds its way home, even if it takes the long road. I hoped he was right. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside my door. They paused, then moved away. I knew it was Vanessa checking if I was asleep. I kept my breathing steady until the house went quiet again. Then I whispered into the darkness, just loud enough for myself to hear. Tomorrow, the real fight begins. When I woke up that morning, the light creeping through the blinds felt different. It wasn't soft or warm. It was sharp, like it was cutting through the air. I got dressed carefully. Choosing the navy cardigan, David always said, made me look strong. Before leaving, I checked the hallway. Vanessa's door was still closed. Patrick's office was quiet when I arrived. The scent of coffee filled the air, and a stack of papers sat waiting on his desk. He smiled faintly when he saw me. Are you ready? As ready as I'll ever be, I said. He pushed a document toward me. This is the affidavit. It outlines the theft, the fraud, and your financial losses. Once you sign, we'll submit it to the district attorney's office. I read each page slowly. Seeing it in writing made everything feel more real, heavier. When I reached the last line, I paused. Patrick, I don't want to destroy my family. He nodded. I know. But sometimes, justice hurts before it heals. I signed. My hand didn't even tremble. By noon, the formal report was filed. The investigator had traced the jewelry to 3 pawnshops across the state, all using Gloria Carter's ID. There were also cash transfers between my old account and an account in Vanessa's name. The total amount was nearly $90,000. Patrick looked at me seriously. This is strong evidence. They can't deny it. When I got home, Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, typing fast. She looked up when I walked in. Morning. Mom. You look nice. Going somewhere special? I smiled faintly. Just had a little errand. She tilted her head, studying me. Her instincts were sharp. She sensed something. I could feel it in the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That evening, I cooked dinner as usual. Ethan joined us late, looking exhausted. The silence at the table was heavy, filled with things unsaid. Vanessa talked too much, her voice too bright. She told some story about a friend's baby shower, laughing at her own jokes. Ethan barely reacted. I didn't speak at all. After dinner, I went to my room and closed the door. My phone buzzed. It was Patrick. The DA's office has accepted the case. They'll start reviewing evidence this week. Keep everything as normal as possible. Don't alert her yet. Normal. That word felt strange now. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Vanessa barely spoke to me. She started spending long hours outside, on the phone, pacing the porch. I couldn't hear what she said, but her tone was tense. Clipped. Ethan avoided both of us. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. I slipped on my robe and moved quietly to the landing. Vanessa's voice carried from the kitchen. You don't understand. She hissed. She knows something. She's been acting different. Ethan murmured something I couldn't hear. No. Vanessa snapped. If she goes to the police, we're done. I pressed a hand to my mouth. We'll figure it out. Ethan said finally. Just calm down. She laughed bitterly. Calm down. She's not some senile old lady anymore. She's planning something. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. I even offered to make pancakes. Vanessa stared at me, searching for weakness, but I gave her none. Later that afternoon, while she was out, Ethan came into the living room. He looked tired, older than his 32 years. Mom, he said quietly. What's going on? I met his eyes. You tell me. Ethan. He swallowed. Vanessa said you've been spreading lies, that you accused her of stealing. And what do you believe? He hesitated. I walked to the side table, picked up the small voice recorder Patrick had given me, and pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled the room. She was talking to Gloria, laughing. She'll never know. By the time she figures it out, the money will be gone. Ethan froze. His face went pale. That's her, I said softly. That's your wife. He sat down slowly, his hands covering his face. I didn't want to believe it. Mom, I thought she loved us both. She loves control. I said, that's all. He stayed silent for a long time. Finally, he whispered, what are you going to do? I already did it. That night, Patrick called again. The DA's office was moving quickly. They'd reached out to the pawnshop owners for verification. The police would soon have enough to issue subpoenas. I sat by the window, staring out at the dark street, the soft hum of the city in the distance. I thought about what would happen when the truth finally broke open. 2 days later, it did. It was a Saturday morning. I was sitting on the porch, reading when a black sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 officers stepped out. Vanessa came out of the house, phone in hand, frowning. Can I help you? She asked. One of the officers held up a document. Mrs. Vanessa Carter Turner. Yes. We have a warrant to collect evidence related to a financial theft investigation. Her face went blank. What? That's ridiculous. I stayed seated, silent, watching. Ethan stepped outside, confusion written across his face. What's going on? The officer explained briefly. Vanessa turned toward me then, her expression twisting. You did this. She spat. I said nothing. They asked for her laptop, her phone, and a few documents from the desk. She tried to argue, but the officers were firm. Ethan looked like he might be sick. When they left, the house was silent except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Vanessa stood in the middle of the room, trembling. "How could you?" she whispered. "After everything I've done for you." I met her eyes. "You stole from me. Vanessa. You lied. You made me feel like a stranger in my own home." Her lip quivered. "You'll regret this. Maybe. But not as much as you will." She stormed upstairs, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled. I didn't move. I just sat there, letting the silence settle around me like armor. That night, Ethan came into my room. His eyes were red. "Mom." I didn't know it had gone this far. "I know," I said softly. He sat beside me, his voice breaking. "What happens now?" "Justice," I said. "Whatever that looks like." He nodded, staring at his hands. "I'll help you however I can." For the first time, I believed him. The house felt strange after that. Vanessa stayed locked in her room most of the time, making phone calls, pacing. Ethan slept on the couch. I went about my routine as if everything were normal. But inside, I knew we were all standing on the edge of something that couldn't be undone, one way or another. The truth was finally free. For the next few days, the house felt like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with silence and tension. Vanessa barely came out of her room. When she did, she moved like a ghost. Her footsteps soft, her expression blank. Ethan spent most of his time outside or at work. He didn't look at me much. And when he did, guilt flickered in his eyes like a shadow he couldn't escape. I went about my days quietly, pretending not to notice the fear running through the walls. Every morning, I brewed coffee, opened the curtains, and turned on the radio like nothing had changed. But I could feel it. The balance had shifted. On the third morning, I found Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked pale and tired, her hair pulled back hastily. When she noticed me, she straightened, trying to smile. "Good morning, Mom," she said softly. "I made you coffee." I hesitated, then sat across from her. "Thank you." She watched me for a long time, her eyes darting nervously. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I waited. Eventually, she spoke. "They took my computer. They took my phone. You know that, right?" I nodded. She swallowed. "They think I did something terrible." "You did," I said quietly. Her voice rose, shaky and desperate. "I didn't mean to. I was trying to help. You don't understand what it's like." Money was tight. My mom needed help with the shelter. Ethan was drowning in debt. "I thought I could fix it before you even noticed." I stared at her. "You sold my memories to fix your problems." Tears filled her eyes. But I didn't believe them anymore. She stood suddenly, her chair scraping across the floor. "You've ruined my life." I kept my voice steady. "You ruined your own." She stormed out, slamming the door. The sound echoed through the empty house. That afternoon, Patrick called. The police had completed their interviews. The pawn shops confirmed that Gloria had brought in the jewelry. The case was being transferred to the prosecutor. He also told me something else. "Maggie. They found out Vanessa transferred several payments from your account to hers using forged authorizations." I felt a strange calm settle over me. "What happens now?" "She'll be charged formally," Patrick said. "There will be a court hearing soon." After we hung up, I sat at the table and stared out the window. The world outside looked normal. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. A bird landed on the fence. But inside, I knew everything was about to change forever. Ethan came home late that night. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Mom, the police came to my office today. They asked about our finances, about Vanessa." "And what did you tell them?" "The truth," he said quietly. "That I didn't know what she was doing." "Do you believe that?" He rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know anymore. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He was my son, and he had been blind. Maybe I had been too. He looked up finally. What's going to happen to her? Whatever the law decides, I said. He nodded slowly. I'm sorry. Mom. I know, I said. But sorry doesn't fix everything. The next morning, I found Vanessa sitting on the porch. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her hair looked like she hadn't brushed it in days. She didn't look at me as I passed. By noon, Patrick called again. The DA's office had officially charged Vanessa with financial fraud and elder exploitation. She would be summoned to court within the week. When I told Ethan, he sat down heavily. She's not a bad person, Mom. She just made mistakes. We all make mistakes, I said. But not everyone steals from the people who love them. That evening, Vanessa came downstairs holding a suitcase. Ethan followed her, confused. Where are you going? He asked. She ignored him, setting the suitcase by the door. You can't stay here anymore, I said. Her eyes flashed with anger. You think you've won. You think the law will save you. I didn't answer. She took a deep breath. I'll leave. But you'll regret this. One day, you'll realize what you did to your own family. I stood still, my voice calm. This isn't about regret. It's about consequences. She looked at Ethan one last time. Are you coming with me? He hesitated. No. Her face crumpled. She grabbed her suitcase and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, looking lost. I didn't move. After a while, he went upstairs without a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the years we'd spent under the same roof, the meals we'd shared, the laughter that had once seemed real. Now it all felt like a lie. The next morning, I drove to Patrick's office. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside were copies of the official charges and the witness statements. He looked at me with quiet respect. You did the right thing, Maggie. I hope so. He nodded. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about peace. On my way home, I stopped at the park where David and I used to walk. The path was covered in golden leaves, and the air smelled of pine. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined him beside me, his hand warm in mine. When I got home, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked up as I entered. Mom. I filed for divorce. I stopped, surprised. I can't stay married to her. Not after everything she did. I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you, Ethan. He nodded, eyes glistening. I'll make this right, Mom. I promise. That night, as the house grew quiet, I went to the closet where the safe once held my treasures. I touched the empty shelves, feeling the cold metal under my fingertips. The things I lost were gone. But somehow, I didn't feel broken anymore. Because now, for the first time, I wasn't living in fear. The truth was out, and it had set me free. The morning after Vanessa left, the house felt quieter than I remembered it ever being. Not peaceful. Not yet. But emptied of that thick, suffocating tension that had lived in its walls for so long. The sun came through the windows again. It touched the floor in wide golden stripes. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like hiding from it. Ethan was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with a mug of coffee. He looked smaller somehow, like he had aged 10 years overnight. When he saw me, he tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I sat beside him. The wood was cool under my hands. You don't have to say anything, I told him. He nodded slowly. I just don't know where to start. Sometimes silence says enough. He took a long sip, staring out at the street. I never thought she could do something like that. I kept making excuses. I thought she just wanted to help. We all see what we want to, I said, especially when it's someone we love. He nodded, his jaw tight. I'm sorry for everything, for not seeing it sooner, for letting her treat you the way she did. I reached over and took his hand. You're my son, Ethan. You made mistakes, but you're still my boy. His eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. Later that day, Patrick called. The arraignment was scheduled for next week. Vanessa and her mother would appear before the judge to hear the charges. My presence wasn't required yet, but I wanted to be there. I needed to see it with my own eyes. In the days leading up to it, I tried to keep busy. I cleaned out the guest room, stripped the sheets, opened the windows. The smell of her perfume still lingered faintly in the curtains. I washed everything twice before it was gone. I found one of her notebooks on the desk. Inside were lists of items, prices, and short notes that made my stomach turn. Bracelet, 2 kelvins. Pearl set, pawn. Salem. Safe code, easy. I closed it slowly and slipped it into the folder for Patrick. Ethan spent most of his time fixing small things around the house. He replaced a loose railing on the porch, mowed the lawn, tightened door hinges. I knew he was trying to make up for something he couldn't undo. I let him. The day of the hearing came cold and gray. I wore David's navy scarf, the one he used to wear to court when he needed courage. Ethan insisted on driving me. The courthouse in Salem was busy, the corridors full of footsteps and murmurs. When we entered the courtroom, I saw Vanessa at the defendant's table. She was wearing a plain beige coat, her hair pulled back neatly. Her mother, Gloria, sat beside her, looking nervous but defiant. For a moment, Vanessa's eyes found mine. There was no hatred in them this time, only something hollow, like she'd finally run out of excuses. The judge read the charges: financial fraud, elder exploitation, theft by deception. Vanessa stood straight, her chin lifted, but her hands were trembling. Gloria kept whispering to her, but she didn't respond. When the judge asked for a plea, Vanessa's lawyer said, "Not guilty." I almost laughed at the irony of it. The hearing was brief. The prosecution presented preliminary evidence: bank statements, pawn records, and the signed affidavit from Patrick's office. The judge scheduled the trial for the following month and set bail conditions. As we left, Vanessa glanced at me again. For a split second, I thought she might say something, but she looked away. Outside, the sky had cleared. Ethan and I walked silently to the car. Halfway there, he stopped. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said softly. "Neither did I." He looked at me. "Do you think she'll go to jail?" I thought about it for a moment. "I don't know, but I think she'll finally understand what she's done." When we got home, I went straight to the garden. The roses David planted were blooming again, their petals deep red and full. I knelt down, touched one gently, and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. Over the next few weeks, reporters started calling. Word had spread about the case: an elderly widow betrayed by her daughter-in-law, fighting back with proof and perseverance. I didn't answer most of them. I wasn't interested in being a headline. I just wanted my peace back. One morning, a package arrived. Inside was a sealed envelope from the prosecutor's office. It contained photographs of my recovered jewelry. My heart clenched when I saw them. Each piece had been tagged and cleaned, ready to be returned once the case concluded. When Ethan came home that evening, I showed him the photos. He smiled sadly. "They look like they belong here again." "They will," I said. "Someday." He hesitated. "Mom, would you be okay if I moved out for a while? I think I need to figure out who I am without her." I nodded. "You should. You deserve a fresh start." He hugged me then, tighter than he had since he was a boy. I love you. Mom, I love you too. Ethan. After he left, the house was quiet again. But this time it wasn't lonely. I sat by the fireplace that evening, watching the flames flicker, thinking about everything that had happened. Vanessa had taken my trust, my memories, even my sense of safety. But she hadn't taken my spirit. I'd found that again, piece by piece, through every sleepless night, every signature, every painful truth. A few days later, Linda stopped by with a pie. She looked me over with that no-nonsense expression she always had. You look lighter, she said. Maybe I am. She smiled. You always were the toughest woman I know. We sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching the sunset paint the sky in orange and pink. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There was no need. When she finally left, I stayed outside until the stars came out. The night air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over yet, the trial still waited, but I knew I'd already won in the ways that mattered. Because I had found myself again. The day of the trial came brighter than I expected. The air outside smelled like wet pavement and spring flowers. I drove to the courthouse alone this time. Ethan had wanted to come, but I told him it was something I needed to face by myself. Inside, the courtroom felt cold. The walls were a pale shade of beige, the kind of color that swallowed emotion. I sat near the back, clutching my small leather purse, trying to steady my breathing. Vanessa was already there, sitting beside her attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her once perfect hair now tied in a plain knot. Her face pale under the fluorescent lights. Gloria sat a few rows behind her, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. For a fleeting second, I wondered if either of them felt any remorse. Patrick arrived moments later and gave me a small, reassuring nod. He leaned down to whisper, "You don't have to speak today, unless they call you. Just stay calm." I nodded. Calm. I'd been telling myself that for weeks. When the judge entered, the courtroom rose in silence. The sound of the gavel echoed like a heartbeat against the walls. The prosecutor stood first, presenting the evidence. He spoke clearly, methodically, explaining each document, each recorded call, each transaction that proved what Vanessa and her mother had done. Then he played the audio recording. My stomach clenched when I heard her voice again. That same tone I'd once trusted. She'll never know. Vanessa had said on the tape, by the time she figures it out, we'll have everything sold. A hush fell over the room. Vanessa's face went pale. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. Patrick leaned closer to me and whispered, "That's the turning point." When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney stood and began talking about misunderstanding, about family miscommunication, about good intentions gone wrong. He painted Vanessa as a woman who had only tried to help, who made mistakes out of stress and financial pressure. I wanted to stand and shout, but I stayed still. I had learned that silence could speak louder than anger. When it was time for witness statements, they called me. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the stand. But once I sat down, something inside me steadied. The prosecutor asked gently, "Mrs. Turner, can you tell the court what those items meant to you?" I looked at the judge, then at Vanessa. The words came slowly at first, then stronger. Those weren't just pieces of jewelry. They were my life's story. Each one was a memory, a milestone. My husband's love, my mother's legacy, my family's history. The prosecutor nodded. "And how did it feel when you discovered they were gone?" I took a deep breath, like someone had erased my past. Vanessa's attorney objected, claiming emotional appeal. But the judge allowed me to continue. I turned toward Vanessa then. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. But I pity you. Because someday you'll realize you didn't just steal from me. You stole from yourself. Her eyes filled with tears. But she didn't speak. When my testimony ended, I stepped down and returned to my seat. My hands were trembling. But I felt lighter. The defense presented their case after that. Vanessa spoke briefly. Her voice small and strained. She said she had only wanted to help. That she'd been overwhelmed by debt and bad advice. Her lawyer prompted her gently. But her words rang hollow in the quiet room. Then came Gloria's turn. She looked defiant at first, chin high. But when the prosecutor showed the pawnshop receipts with her signature, the confidence drained from her face. I was just helping my daughter, she said weakly. The prosecutor pressed. You accepted over $70,000 in property that didn't belong to you. She didn't answer. When the closing arguments began, I barely heard the words. My mind drifted to David. I imagined him sitting beside me, his hand warm on mine, whispering that he was proud. After hours of arguments, the judge called for a short recess. I stepped outside for air. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds. But the air felt clean. Patrick joined me on the steps. You did well, he said. They don't have much left to stand on. I nodded, feeling exhausted but calm. Do you think the judge will convict her? He looked thoughtful. I think the truth already did. When we returned, everyone stood as the judge entered again. The courtroom fell silent. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The judge spoke slowly, his voice steady and firm. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the court finds the defendants guilty of financial fraud and elder exploitation. A murmur ran through the room. Vanessa covered her face with her hands. Gloria gasped quietly. Slumping in her seat, the judge continued, sentencing Gloria to community service and restitution. Vanessa was given 2 years in state custody, with eligibility for early release pending restitution and counseling. It wasn't a long sentence, but it was enough. When it was over, I stood quietly. Vanessa looked at me through her tears. For a moment, she seemed like a child again, lost and afraid. I wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was pity and a strange kind of peace. Outside the courthouse, the air was bright again. Patrick shook my hand. Justice served. Maggie, you can start healing now. I smiled faintly. Maybe we both can. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the road, the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. Everything felt strangely quiet, like the world had exhaled after holding its breath too long. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, not bigger or smaller, just mine again. I went inside, set my purse on the counter, and walked to the window. The garden was full of light. The roses swayed gently in the breeze. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself smile. The past had been bruised, but not destroyed. My life had been shaken, but not taken. Somewhere deep inside, I heard David's voice again. You did it, Maggie. You stood your ground. And for the first time since he left this world, I whispered back, I know. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was home again. The days after the trial passed quietly, almost too quietly. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or sharp. It was soft, like a blanket, something that finally belonged to me again. The mornings felt different too. The light that poured through the kitchen window seemed warmer, kinder. I would sit with my coffee, listening to the creak of the old floorboards, feeling peace in the smallest sounds. One afternoon, a delivery van stopped in front of the house. A man stepped out with a sealed box labeled Property Release, Salem Courthouse. My hands trembled when I signed for it. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of white paper, were my things. My mother's pearls, David's gold bracelet, The emerald earrings from our anniversary. I lifted each piece gently, the weight of them bringing tears I didn't try to hide. For months I had lived with anger, fear, and loss. But holding those things again, I realized it wasn't just the jewelry I had been missing. It was the feeling of being whole. Ethan came over that evening. He looked better. Clearer somehow. Like a man starting over. He brought dinner. Simple pasta and salad. And insisted on washing the dishes afterward. When he was done, he sat across from me. "Mom," he said softly, "I talked to Vanessa's lawyer. She's serving her sentence in a minimum facility near Eugene. She asked if she could write you a letter." I put my fork down. What would I do with that? He hesitated. Maybe it's her way of apologizing. I thought for a long time. Tell her she can write if she needs to. I said finally. But I don't promise I'll answer. He nodded. We sat together for a while. The hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Then he looked around the room and smiled faintly. "It feels different here now. Lighter." "It is," I said. "Because it's honest again." That weekend, Lauren and Daniel came to visit. Lauren hugged me tight and whispered, "You did it. Mom, you really did it." Daniel brought a small gift. A framed photo of David smiling on the beach. The wind blowing through his hair. I placed it on the mantel, where it belonged. For the first time in years, the living room felt like ours again. Not something borrowed or staged. We spent the afternoon talking, laughing, eating pie. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the sound of real laughter in this house. Later that night, after they left, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea. The old clock ticked softly, and I thought about everything that had happened. It still amazed me how easily a life could fracture. How betrayal could seep in quietly until you no longer recognized your own home. But even more, I marveled at how resilience could grow in those cracks. Like wildflowers pushing through broken pavement. A week later, Ethan stopped by again. He had been seeing a therapist, trying to rebuild. He told me he wanted to move to Portland, start a new job, maybe even teach part-time. I was proud of him, though I knew it would make the house feel emptier. Before he left, he hugged me again. "You're stronger than anyone I know." "Mom." I smiled. I just stopped letting people tell me who I am. After he drove away, I went into the garden. The roses were in full bloom again. Red and gold. Heavy with life. I trimmed them carefully, remembering how David used to say, "Gardening was like faith. You nurture what you can't control and trust that beauty will return in its own time." That evening, I sat by the window and opened the letter Vanessa had sent. Her handwriting was neat but hesitant. She said she was sorry, that prison had given her too much time to think, that she finally understood what she'd done. She wrote about her mother too, who had broken down during community service and begged forgiveness she didn't think she deserved. I read the letter twice. Then, I folded it neatly and put it in the drawer with my other papers. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel pity either. Just closure. A few days later, I met with Patrick one last time. He smiled when he saw me. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "People in my office still talk about your case. You reminded us what determination looks like." I laughed softly. I wasn't trying to make a statement. "Patrick, I just wanted my life back. And you got it." When I left his office, I felt lighter. The clouds had cleared, and sunlight poured across the sidewalk. I walked slowly to my car, breathing in the crisp air. That night, I took the jewelry box to my room and placed each piece back into the safe. Not because I feared losing them again, but because it felt right to keep them where they belonged. When I closed the door of the safe, I whispered a quiet goodbye to the past. Weeks turned into months. The story that had once shaken me became something distant. A lesson carved deep but no longer raw. I started volunteering at the library, helping seniors with technology. I baked again. I invited neighbors over for coffee. Sometimes I caught myself smiling for no reason. One evening, I sat on the porch with Linda. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple. She sipped her tea and said, "You know, Maggie, I think you've found your peace." "Maybe I have," I said. "Or maybe peace found me when I stopped waiting for it." She smiled and patted my hand. "Either way, you earned it." After she left, I stayed outside a little longer, watching the sky fade into twilight. The first stars began to appear, faint and distant, but steady. I thought of David again, of the promise I'd made to protect what we built. I had kept it, in ways neither of us could have imagined. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. I turned off the lights, walked down the hallway, and paused at the doorway of my bedroom. On the dresser, the picture of David caught a sliver of moonlight. He was smiling, the same way he always had when he looked at me. I smiled back. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And this time, it was entirely my own life. The next spring arrived softer than any before it. The air smelled like rain and lilacs. And the mornings came earlier, golden and forgiving. I woke up each day without that tightness in my chest, without the dread that used to follow me like a shadow. Life had become quieter, smaller in the best way. Ethan moved to Portland a few months ago. He still called every Sunday, just like his father used to when he was traveling for work. We talked about simple things: his new job, the tiny apartment he was proud of, the dog he adopted from a shelter. Sometimes we laughed so hard we both cried. He sounded lighter now. It's freer. I think we both were. I still saw Lauren and Daniel often. They came by with their kids on weekends, filling the house with noise and chaos that made me smile. Watching my grandchildren play in the yard, where their father once built tree houses, reminded me that time has a way of circling back, healing what it can, softening what it can't. The garden became my favorite place again. The roses David planted were taller now, thick with new buds. I spent mornings trimming, watering, whispering to them like old friends. Some days I would sit out there for hours, reading or just listening to the birds. One afternoon, I got another letter from Vanessa. It came from a halfway house in Eugene. The envelope was plain, the handwriting still careful but steadier this time. She wrote about counseling, about the programs she was attending, about finding work once she finished her sentence. At the end, she wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you can believe I'm trying to be better." I folded the letter slowly and set it aside. Forgiveness wasn't something I could force, but I realized it had already begun, quietly, without my permission. Not because she deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry her anymore. That evening, I took out my journal, the same one I'd been writing in since everything started. I read through the old entries, the ones filled with fear, anger, and grief. The handwriting trembled in those early pages, but by the end, it grew steadier. I wrote one last entry. Justice came, and peace followed. Not because I won, but because I refused to lose myself. Then I closed the book and put it away. In the weeks that followed, I started volunteering at the local community center. They had a program helping older adults learn technology, and I found joy in teaching again. It was strange how life gave back when you least expected it. One morning after class, a woman named Carol pulled me aside. She said she'd heard about my case and wanted to thank me for speaking out. Her sister had gone through something similar but had been too afraid to report it. Because of my story, she said. Her sister finally found the courage. I didn't know what to say. I just hugged her. When I drove home that afternoon, I realized something. What I'd gone through wasn't just about losing jewelry or money. It was about finding strength and maybe sharing that strength was the only way to make it mean something. That night, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky fade into deep blue. The first stars blinked faintly above the trees. I thought about how far I'd come from the woman who once stood in front of an empty safe, trembling. I remembered how powerless I had felt then, how trapped. But I also remembered the moment I decided to fight back. The moment I said enough. That moment had changed everything. Life doesn't hand you peace, I thought. You build it. One brave decision at a time. A week later, the local paper called. They were doing a feature on elder financial abuse and wanted to interview me. I hesitated. But Patrick encouraged me. If your story helps even one person protect themselves, Maggie, it's worth it. So I said yes. The article came out in early June. The headline read, "Salem Widow Fights Back, a Story of Strength, Justice, and Renewal." The photo showed me standing in my garden, smiling beside the roses. When I saw it, I laughed, not because I cared about being in the paper, but because I could finally look at that picture and recognize the woman in it. That was me, whole again. Months passed. Summer came with its warm evenings and long shadows. The house was still old, still creaky in places, but now it felt alive. I hosted small dinners, baked pies, and filled the air with the smell of cinnamon and vanilla again. Sometimes Linda came over, teasing me for finally using the good china after all these years. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, I sat on the porch steps with a glass of iced tea and looked around. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and fireflies danced over the grass. I thought about David, about how proud he would have been, about how life had found a way to start over without starting from scratch. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Ethan had come by, unexpectedly, holding 2 cups of coffee. He sat beside me without saying a word, just watching the sky. "You okay?" "Mom," he asked finally. I smiled. "Better than okay." He nodded, looking relieved. For a while, we sat in silence. The world felt still, content, and I realized that peace wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about knowing it no longer had the power to hurt me. When he left later that night, I stayed outside a bit longer, watching the stars come out one by one. The wind rustled through the trees, and I felt the same quiet strength I used to feel when David stood beside me. I whispered softly into the dark. I kept my promise. Love. I protected what we built. And then I smiled, because I knew he would have smiled too. So here I am now, living the life I thought was gone, finding joy in the ordinary and strength in every quiet morning. If my story finds you in a moment of doubt, I hope it reminds you that no matter what is taken from you, your courage is something no one can steal. Sometimes, justice comes quietly. Sometimes, it comes with a fight. But it always comes for those who stand their ground. If you're still listening, stay with me for the next story, because life, as I've learned, always has more to tell.